Happy Friday, all. Welcome to another privacy chat. I'm Jules Polonetsky. Hopefully you know that if you are on my page, and if you've stumbled here because you're interested in research, because the algorithm behind LinkedIn decided you'd be interested in a chat with our Senior Fellow Marjory Blumenthal and Shea Swauger, who leads our work on ethics and research. We're going to talk about a topic that is actually provocative, sexy, dramatic. It may not sound super so for those of you who think, I don't know, the only exciting issues are, should we ban TikTok or the latest drama of the day? But this issue, corporate data sharing for research, not only has ramifications on the future of science and how we acquire knowledge and how researchers make advances, but yeah, what we should do about TikTok. All right, so let me set up. A number of years ago, Future Privacy Forum held a day-long symposium on ethics. And we were really first starting to explore, I think we did this with our colleagues at the Washington University Law School Law Review. We were just starting to explore the notion of, are there areas beyond law that should shape decisions that businesses make? To our surprise, a significant academic community showed up. And it turned out that not only were sort of corporate CPOs sort of saying, where does ethics fit into what I do, right? Data protection experts know that, for instance, the GDPR talks about balancing the rights and freedoms of individuals. And some of those are clearly like, don't violate laws and rights. But there is a penumbra there that perhaps is a bit broader. What does it mean when you're focusing on autonomy and so forth? It's probably more than just a very narrow data protection concept, right? But the academic community showed up, and it turned out that they had a range of concerns about how IRBs, who in many cases governed what they could do when they were collecting data, or increasingly, they weren't collecting data in the traditional way. Please be part of my experiment. I'll give you a candy bar. Often students on campuses, that's the easiest audience for some academics to engage, or students in their class. Here is or just, as part of the class, you will participate in these sorts of things and help your friends and so forth. And so, the whole notion of I'm coming in for medical treatment, and the doctor says, we really would like to learn from this. This is new. This is novel. This is we're trying to understand the side effects. And so do you go through a very clear, well-known, well-regulated, structured process, whether it's a health and medical one with its particular system of oversight, or the general system of oversight that exists for IRBs or Helsinki commissions, as they're sometimes known, elsewhere. But it turned out that academics were, I want to just study all this Twitter data. It's there. It's public. I don't have to collect it. I'd like to analyze what's going on. And that could be, is there Russian disinformation? Or could it be, I don't know, are people really addicted to this stuff? Or what time do they use it? Or do people talk to their friends? Or do they meet new people? Is it connected? I mean, there's a plethora of information that academics started seeing. This wasn't brand new, but increasingly previously collected data, big data, or data collected by companies for a purpose, like Amazon for shopping, was of interest. If you're studying the economy and you want to know about inflation and so forth, there are traditional, ways to get data. But oh my goodness, what is clearly there if you could study retail changes? But we also started seeing downsides. We saw companies saying, hey, I'm going to study mobile telephone movements because I want to know where the refugees are so we can get them emergency food. Now you've also perhaps disclosed, even though maybe in large aggregate, to the people threatening those refugees, those movements, right? And so academics started struggling with what rules should be in place for this sort of data, public data or data collected by companies. And in the very famous or infamous, shall we say, Facebook emotional contagion case, the public took a hard look at an interesting experiment done by an academic with an IRB engaged to the point that the IRB said, oh, you're not collecting data. You're just studying what Facebook is doing because Facebook wants to learn whether or not certain changes might make people happier or sadder based on how the algorithm brings them, good or bad news from their friends. Interesting. What's the ideal metric there? And if Facebook just does it because they do A/B testing, we don't really talk about it. But because one engaged an academic who is bringing some standard of oversight and morality and ethics to it, we look a little bit harder and we say, what are the rules there? So we started realizing that academics wanted access to corporate data, that there was a very limited number of companies, some of the big tech ones or others, that were regularly sharing. And when they were, it was often for their benefit. Oh, look at the good things we're doing. We can help you learn about climate change. It wasn't necessarily, hey, academics are studying things, maybe things we don't even like, maybe things about us that might make us look bad, but for the purpose of knowledge and science. And we started learning that there were risks. There were companies who didn't want to share data. A, they didn't want to be embarrassed. Or B, it was personal information and they say they don't share data. Or what would the ethics be of studying things that could be, anyway, let me catch up to today. We have just released, Shea and Marjory, and credit to Professor Sarah Jordan, who played a big role on this, a playbook written a little bit in the style of a play for policymakers, for companies, for others who are interested in the parameters around corporate data sharing for research. So Shea, you've been the lead. Tell us what we did and why we did it and what you learned.
Thanks. So the playbook it comes from a series of virtual dinners in 2021 towards the end. And those conversations were synthesized. And I think I took away a few things. One, there are way more people interested in this question than I first anticipated. And it has so much intersections across academia, business, law, government, and that no one sector alone could provide an adequate answer to how to do this well. And so I think the nature of solving this is going to be interdisciplinary. Like that's a pretty core finding for us. Some other things that came up were, after we identify who's a stakeholder in this, we had to figure out who's responsible for what activities. So who kicks off an initial request for data, who has purview of ethical and legal review, how does it get shared in a way that preserves privacy, and then there's a lot of technical underbelly to how to operationalize this kind of data sharing. So the playbook provides recommendations based on sector. So if you're a company, there's action items for if you want to share data. Here's some things that you need to ask yourself as an organization. Do we have capacity for this? Is the data fit for this kind of purpose? If you're a researcher, there's definitely questions and operational tasks to do and creating an environment that you could receive personal data. If you're an institution like a university, what kinds of legal staff and remit do we have to do this kind of review? So there's definitely actionable takeaways. Like this is an applied document that I thought was really helpful depending on the stakeholder. But Marjory, you are a major part of this. I'd love to hear, what you thought or some of the takeaways.
Sure. So Jules had mentioned that there were concerns about risks and also the need to balance ethics and risks. So in many ways, I could boil down this playbook to saying that it should help companies go from FUD to FOMO, to the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that is inspired by concern about risks to fear of missing out, because really there is so much opportunity for the world to learn for reasons that both you and Jules have said. And if companies can show that they contribute by giving in kind to the support of research, they'll be giving the data, they can help both general knowledge, but also in many ways increase their own reputation and their own insights from their data. The other comment I would make is to build on something that you touched on, Shea, which is really any kind of company can be involved. You know, there's a lot in the news about social media, platform data. It's really important that we understand what's going on with that kind of data because of some of the adverse consequences. But, you know, manufacturing, Jules mentioned health, agriculture, you know, you name it, any kind of company in this era of big data generates data. And the more that we connect with researchers, the more there's a virtuous cycle that benefits us all. And that's partly why some people use terms like data for good, because we generally think that research is part of good.
From FUD to FOMO, I love it. You know, we work extensively in the area of ed tech and student data. And one of the valid criticisms that some critics have is they say, all these ed tech apps, these technologies, is it really helping, right? Does Duolingo work better than a traditional French class? Do these apps that try to incentivize kids to learn with games, do they work? Are we wasting our time and money? And so we say, well, we need to study that. No, you're experimenting now you're experimenting on children, right? Well, maybe what we're doing isn't working, right? We need to assess whether what we're doing is creating harm. The status quo may or may not be the ideal situation for us. And, you know, one big turning point, I think, was when many concerned about social media, Facebook, nowadays TikTok, wanted to start to study what effect those platforms were having on us. Were they making us happy, sad, body obsessed, body shamed? Were they connecting us for jobs, or were they wasting our days? Was Russian disinformation happening there? Did it affect the election? Did it divide us? Is it making race relations worse, right? Well, we could ask the platforms to just give us reports and tell us, or we could have academic researchers. And then again, that's a little tricky, right? Who is an academic researcher? And I think the report sort of points out a little bit, I'm at a think tank. Well, I'm an adjunct sometimes, but at a law school. I'm not a researcher. I do research, but right? Like, so do I get it because you trust me, or do I need to be at an academic institution where there's some IRB, or there's some who might say, again, this data was already collected, so it doesn't maybe fit the traditional. Or what about the blogger, or the reporter, or the random expert who happens to be the most expert on studying disinformation because that's been their life passion? So there are a lot of really hard questions when I say, hey, platform, make sure you get the data. So we've seen legislative efforts to force, and the platforms, of course, say privacy risk. So if you force us, we might accidentally give the data away through an API, right? Twitter is making changes to its API and researchers are unhappy. But when you have an API, who uses it? Is it Cambridge Analytica and bad actors? So the platforms are like, give us some rules if you want us to allow the data. Tell us who it should go to. The Europeans haven't waited for us to figure this out on the US side. The Data Act, right, sets a structure in place to mandate this sharing. EDMO is a code that an expert group worked on to help structure this. And in many ways, I think the Playbook starts to set some of these rules.
Yes. So just to unpack some of what you referred to, the Playbook shows that well done research is really very businesslike. There are processes, there's oversight and governance. There are disciplinary and institutional codes of practice, concerns about integrity, training, compliance, all the things that somebody in business would expect for various employees, you can find in a well-run research institution and with credentialed researchers. So again, there shouldn't be fear that research is intrinsically risky. In fact, well done research is done in an environment with a lot of checks and balances, and that should give companies confidence about sharing data and that good things can happen with it.
So you brought up a couple points. First, I want to make sure that anyone in the audience, if you have questions, throw them our way. We'd love to take them. Calls for accountability outside of a company, I think, are legitimate. I think that those are good things. We want accountability and transparency. Unless you invite an independent third party in, it's really hard to take any sort of findings as credible. And so by inviting in researchers that are not affiliated with a company, and having some protections in place that the research is going to be independent, that the company can't necessarily influence the findings, it makes when you share that kind of data, there's a believability, there's some heft to it. And also companies pushing back on that have some legitimate concerns. There is a risk of violating privacy. And so it takes really thoughtful design on how do you use certain techniques. I mean, pets come up a lot in, if we're going to share data, how do we do it in a way that preserves user privacy? So the risks are real, but they are surmountable. I think that's one of my takeaways is that, yes, there are privacy risks. We know ways to do it well, and the benefits outweigh the risks all the time.
So just to expand on your reference to privacy enhancing technologies, there are many ways to de-identify data in data sharing agreements. Remember when companies give data to researchers, they aren't just sending off, what we used to do, a floppy disk. They are making sure that there are agreements in place, and they are making sure that the data that are handed over have been de-identified and otherwise made acceptable for sharing. There are uses of trusted execution environments. There are uses of secure cloud services. There are uses of lots of mechanisms that are designed to protect privacy and security of the data in the sharing process. So, tools, techniques, practices, all of those are available to make the data sharing for research a relatively trustworthy process.
Mm-hmm.
Can we pull up the infographic that the team put together that I think tries to help visualize some of these issues? And I wonder if you guys can walk us through a little bit, because I think this captures, please read the entire paper. But for those of you who are visual learners and want a snapshot that sets it out, and please, all of our work is released under a license that allows anyone to use it, certainly for non-commercial, just give us credit, which is there in that little corner. So feel free to blow it up and put it on your wall or so forth. Shea, Marjory, what's happening here? Walk us through.
All right. So on the left side, we have sort of a list of the stakeholders. So who's involved, and it goes through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different categories of the people typically involved in data sharing for research. On the right-hand side, it talks about what are the steps practically that you need to take as an organization? And these are called preparing for action. That's a reference to in the document. We've got these boxes of preparing for action that, depending on who you are, what's your first step or your second step. And in the middle section, you see it kind of goes back and forth from left to right, the process. So how do you initiate this? What kinds of let's see, so responsible data sharing for research creates benefits. It goes through some of what those benefits are. Then next step is some challenges. These are the things that in most data sharing agreements, unless the data is super not sensitive, you're going to run into. And what are the steps and processes that are going to allow you to overcome those challenges? And I think it ends with some of the benefits, and next, like it turns into a cycle of, what happens after that first share. What is the long-term plan for data sharing? But Marjorie, anything you want to add to this?
So as you think about the long term, there is one aspect in the research world that remains a work in progress. And that is that after the researcher has gotten the data with agreements and terms and conditions and protections and all of that good stuff. In today's research world, publications and the larger world of researchers often want to have their own access to data. And it often is the case that for good reasons, companies are reluctant to say that when I share data for research with a vetted team on a vetted project, I am now giving it away, in perpetuity to anyone. So we're not there yet, except in the very limited cases where data, in fact, becomes open data or made arrangements through an open process. Most of what we're talking about here is much more controlled and less open, and yet made available for research.
Yeah, to expand on Marjorie's point, the reason a data researcher would want, their own access to data, first of all, if I'm only using a very structured environment provided by, the company, I'm limited in what I can do. I'm limited in maybe being able to rerun the experiment to make sure I got it right. Or even worse, we have a real problem today where we see people running experiments that have been done years ago, and then someone else comes along and says, actually, they did it all wrong, or they kind of fudged their results. Like, no, that's wrong. And sometimes it's just interesting, and sometimes it's, oh my God, we've been making, therefore, bad decisions, whether it's public policy or medical or whatever. There've been, scandals. And so there's a huge demand in the research community and in the various journals and publications that the data be there so others can go back and see the magic, the incredible correlations that you came up with are actually, you made a big mistake. You didn't take into account, this thing or that thing. So, we have some really hard problems here, right? In an ideal world, we'd have different administrative data centers, and some of these do exist. There are universities that are housing large sets of data. Maybe the biggest famous example is the US Census collects a lot of data, and there are researchers who need access to it, not just published reports. They need it at maybe a more granular level, and they can come in, and it is a crime to, misuse the data, and there's a real strict process. But there are times where you might need to bring your data to the data set, or combine data sets in a way that, if it was public, would be too risky, but might be done with appropriate control. So Playbook really walks through a lot of the challenges and issues. The big surprise to me, frankly, when I started learning about this, was that the biggest problem, and I think, Marjorie, you said this, but it's worth expounded on, or maybe Shea, you said this, it's the data being fit for the purpose. So let me give you a good example. Again, a number of years ago, in an earlier pandemic, pre-COVID, there was interesting work done, again, with the cell carriers to try to understand proximity of how certain diseases would spread. And so the cell company said, oh, we have proximity data. Here's our report about who was close to who. And all kinds of interesting work was done to predict whether or not contagion worked in this way and another way. And then, of course, it turned out that what they meant by how their assessment of proximity and location worked was radically different than what the researchers thought it meant and said. I don't know how closely you all follow sort of ad tech, but every 6 months, it turns out that people have been paying money and making decisions and so forth, and all the numbers they had were wrong. The reporting they got from whoever telling them that people clicked on this or that. These are systems built primarily to tell you at huge expense with some of the brightest, number crunching people that this is what they're doing. And it turns out that they were counting clicks or saying how many seconds of video were watched, and it was all wrong. And this is a system built for that purpose. So now I take that and I say, oh, can I answer your question? I'm Uber and I have information about, vehicles moving around. The system was built for certain sorts of purposes. A researcher typically has very specific needs to understand data in X way. So if I simply give you some giant truck of data and you haven't worked at my company for years and you don't know the nuances and the mess that that data is and the work that the company needs to do to turn that raw data into something usable for their purposes, and it doesn't come with those labels, the tags, the awareness that in 3 years ago they actually had a blackout and all the data was kind of messy and it didn't really matter because they weren't billing people for it. So whatever, they just estimated, but now you're relying on that like it's science. So the whole notion of data being, you know, fit for the purpose, the hygiene and the needs, or the researcher being capable of taking terabytes of data and actually storing it properly at the scale that some of these companies do. And again, there are big sophisticated environments, but maybe the blogger who's a researcher, you know, isn't or doesn't. So there, I really urge people to go through the report. It helps spell out why it's not just so easy, absolutely worth doing. And we are champions of it and do believe that with the right processes and controls, it's morally right. It's FOMO. If you're not doing it, you ought to be missing out. On the notion of missing out, Shea, I don't think we've announced the winners. We provide an annual award, and we get a lot of competitive applications from, and this award is for a researcher collaborating with a company to provide data while obviously doing so in a way that is thoughtful. What have we announced? We've announced this prize now a couple of times. It's a nice annual award. We take an ad in the New York Times and in Science Magazine and really share and give it a lot of credit. Are we announcing this soon? Have we announced the date, the time, the winners yet?
We're going to be announcing, I think, in early May. So we're working with the winners now. I just want to make a comment around some of the applications we've seen. First of all, fantastic examples of data sharing. And one thing, to your point earlier, that was pretty consistent in the applications of people really doing it well is that it wasn't a one-time request between them. To your fit for data purpose, there was ongoing communication between companies and between researchers to discuss things like, what are the methods? What kind of data do you need? How do we as a business need to process or pre-process this before it gets to you to make sure that we're not just giving you a dump of garbage and that you actually have capacity to understand the things that we're giving you. And so data sharing is an ongoing relationship. It's largely built on trust over time. And the people that are doing it really well in the way that we saw in those applications have a relationship with someone that is consistent over time, that they can talk to the engineering team if they need to, they can bring in the legal team if they need to. But I am really excited for these winners in this award. I think that they did so many things well that everyone can learn from, regardless of what kind of stakeholder you are in this process.
Thanks to the Alfred Sloan Foundation for supporting this award. And one area that we and they were particularly focused on this year is dealing with this elitist issue, shall we say. Here's how some data gets shared. You went to Stanford. You did a startup. Your startup has really interesting and cool data. And you get a call from a professor at Stanford or the president or some VIP. And of course, you want to help your alma mater. And so, well, those elite institutions or institutions with important brands where the CEO has a relationship or somebody senior, or they just went to school together, often get kind of one-off access to really interesting stuff. And you might be at an HBCU, you might be at a big public university where you may or may not have those relationships. And the work you're doing and your capability is 100% to really, you know, advance something important. But the company, you email them and they're like, what? You want our customer data? What? We'll call the police. Like, what are you, a hacker? Who? Like, what do you mean? No, privacy. And then my colleagues, right, the people in the privacy world, the CPOs are like, oh, wait, what's the risk? And so on and so forth. So we really wanted to encourage in our outreach inclusion of a much broader set of universities. This has been a big priority for NSF as well, that researchers, you know, all end up being a very homogenous group. At the end of the day, this is how science advances. And, you know, we want to have the full participation of the best minds of society working on these things. It's important that we do more than sort of one-off, I'll get some good publicity if I do something with this brand school. This is about advancing science in a, broad and ethical way. We have taken 30 minutes, but I'm going to let you guys do a quick last thought. Did we not cover anything that you think ought to be mentioned?
Marjorie, after you.
I would just build on Jules's comments about what the census does to say that there now is a new category of data intermediaries, and there are technologies like secure multi-party computation where you end up taking your computation to the data. There are more and more ways to make data sharing for research to be safe and trustworthy. So we hope more companies do it.
Final thought for me is that if this is something that you're interested in, FPF has a working group specifically dedicated to ethics, data, and research, and it's open to anyone. You don't have to be an FPF member, although members are encouraged to join as well. And this is what we talk about every month. There's a listserv. It's a great group of people, and I'd love to see you there.
Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you, Shea, for your work on this and for joining me today, and encourage folks to download the report. Thanks to those of you who chimed in and for joining us. Happy Friday.